We are very happy to have with us today Professor Doris Fuchs. She is the director of the Research Institute for Sustainability at Helmholtz Centre Potsdam, and also professor for sustainable development at University of Munich. I'm very happy that I got you to come to this webinar and present your thoughts about power and sustainable consumption, Doris. So without further ado, I'll leave the word to you.
Thank you so much, Asa. Thank you also for inviting me to talk about power and sustainable consumption. Two topics very, very close to my research heart. Just a slight correction. I'm not at the University of Munich. I'm at the University of Münster with my professorship. That's something that's often confused because they both start the same. So sustainable consumption and power, as I said already, those are topics very, very close to my heart. And I think they are at the core of the challenges in terms of the sustainability transition that we are facing. And I'll try to lay that out, that argument, in terms of by starting first talking very quickly about environmental impact of consumption. I'm sure you all know a lot about that. I'll then sketch out what truly sustainable consumption perhaps could look like. I'll talk about what's keeping us from really pursuing it. I'll navigate towards getting beyond this entrenched unsustainability, and I'll close with reminding us of what we need to consider when we want to ponder ways to move forward. So the environmental impact of consumption, we've known this now for I think 30 years in terms of research, that consumption is a huge problem in terms of the environmental challenges that we have posed for ourselves and that we're facing. And the IPCC finally decided that they needed to focus on that too. And so in the last IPCC report, chapter 5, explicitly focused on the role of demand. And they highlighted not only that demand is a huge driver of climate change, but they also highlighted the immense potential that is in the potential to mitigate, to reduce our impact, the drivers of climate change. We also know what are the main areas causing this problem. It's transport, especially transport based on fossil fuels. It's food, especially meat and dairy products. It's housing, both the resources going into construction, but also the energy we use, especially heating and cooling energy. And finally, it's resource-intensive leisure activities that make us use a lot of resources, more than we actually have. Now, given that we've known this for a really long time, that this is a problem, the question is, what are we doing about it, or what have we done about it? And if we look at the prevailing policy approaches to sustainable consumption, those have basically been two. First, we've tried to foster technological innovation. We've tried to create efficiency gains in terms of production and to reduce waste. And the problem with that is that we've faced a lot of rebound effects. So maybe our refrigerators have gotten more efficient, but I don't know how it is in Sweden and Germany. They've also become a lot bigger. And we notice this in all kinds of areas. So wherever we've been able to save resources, to save energy, we found other ways to spend this energy, to consume more in other areas. So there are all kinds of rebound effects. And the empirical evidence just tells us, for as long as we've tried to do this, that technological solutions so far have been vastly insufficient for solving the complex problems that we have when it comes to the sustainability of consumption. The second policy approach that we've tried is we've tried to improve consumer awareness and to change consumer behavior. We've basically told consumers, buy greener, buy fairer products, and then that will help us. That will help us save the world. Now, this hasn't worked for all kinds of problems that I'm sure you also are aware of. It's the attitude-behavior gap. So consumers may find the environment important, but don't act as much on it as they also themselves believe they do. It's the Behavior Impact Act. So even if consumers shop differently, the impact that is needed is not achieved that way. And that is related to a range of problems. One is the lack of transparency. So consumers face a billion labels and have no chance of knowing which labels really mean something, which really make a difference. Also, and their consumption is just embedded in structural contexts that determine a lot of the resources that are being used, irrespective actually of what consumers do. I'm getting a signal that my audio is not working. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, if not, please, well, I don't know how you would get to me. Okay.
I will let you know.
Okay. The more fundamental problem here is that beyond this buy greener, buy fairer products, the logic is still buy more. It's not buy less or buy as much as you, only as much as you need. It's still the buy more logic. And in general, this approach to focus on the individual consumer has meant that a responsibilization of individuals as consumers. It's meant a depoliticization of the issue. It's not one anymore than we as a society have to tackle together. Then it's not one that has to be at the core of the political focus. It's shifted to the consumer. And the result of all of this is a huge policy failure. Our consumption is as unsustainable as it used to be in most areas, if not more. And as I said before, whatever we've made in improvements in certain areas, we've tended to throw out the window by more consumption in other areas. So what then could a way forward in terms of truly sustainable consumption be? What could truly sustainable consumption, that's not just a bit greener and not just a bit fairer, what could it look like? And one way to think about this would be to say, well, sustainable consumption most of all means consuming enough so that everybody can live a good life, everybody who's living now and in the future. And that's the idea that's behind the concept of consumption corridors. So the concept of consumption corridors says we all need to have a certain minimum amount of consumption because we need to fulfill our needs that we have as human beings. And we need to be able to satisfy those needs if we want to be able to live a good life. Those needs are, of course, you know, we all need to eat, we all need to drink, we all need protection against too much heat, against too much cold. We all need a certain level of mobility, a certain level of partaking in society, and all of that. Now, in order to satisfy those needs, we all need to be able to consume a certain amount of resources. Otherwise, that won't be possible. However, in a world of limited resources, and the concept of planetary boundaries reminds us that we live in a world of limited resources. Thinking about consumption in terms of being able to satisfy the minimum amount of consumption necessary for a good life for all means that we also need to think about consumption maxima. We also need to think about that there may be a level of consumption that we cannot overstep if we want for others to be able to satisfy their minimum consumption levels. And then between these consumption minima and consumption maxima would be a sustainable consumption corridor, a corridor where we could consume as we like, where we can design the lifestyles according to our preferences without hurting others and without hurting the planet. Just as a background again, so the consumption corridors approach, it starts from a needs-based perspective on a good life. And in this context, it distinguishes between needs, wants, and satisfiers. And that's the core underlying the argument. Needs are universal. they're satiable, that is limited, and that's really important for us in our sustainability context, and they're unsubstitutable. And because of these qualities, they have a certain legitimacy. People should be able to satisfy these needs. They don't need to be able to satisfy every want they have, because wants tend to be insatiable. They also tend to be substitutable. And certainly they don't need to have access to every satisfier they want to use to satisfy their needs. Satisfiers are also highly substitutable. They have this legitimacy because people need to be able to satisfy their needs if they are able to live a good life. And because they have this kind of legitimacy to the claim, that also means that being able to satisfy these needs deserves protection. And that's why Antonietta Di Giulio and Rico De Fila, for instance, speak about protected needs in this context. And it also means that as society, we have a certain responsibility for making it possible that people are able to satisfy these needs, and therefore that people are able to have access to the minimum amount of resources that the consumption corridors concept envisions. So consumption corridors basically says, if we want to talk about sustainable consumption, we need to think about what a good life for all within planetary boundaries would mean. And that would mean that we need to talk about minimum and maximum levels of consumption with each other. Now, obviously, that's a far different view of the consumption system of the world than where we are now. And but given that we've known for a long time that what we've been doing so far hasn't been working, the question is, why aren't we moving closer to this or some other vision of a really sustainable consumption system? And what I'm going to talk about now are insights from the EU 1.5 Lifestyles project that's funded within the EU Horizon Europe program. And colleagues from Lund are part of this consortium. And in this consortium, we're looking at what is needed, what would be needed if we really want to take the Paris climate target seriously, and if we want to live lifestyles that are in line with those climate targets. And we look at that by looking at both at what households can do, what are impactful lifestyle options, but as importantly, if not more importantly, we also look at what the structural contexts of consumptions are. What are the structural contexts that keep us from having truly sustainable consumption systems? And the 7 most impactful structures hindering 1.5 degree lifestyles that we have identified are, first of all, the economic growth paradigm, the lack of coherent, predictable, and integrated policies, the systematic influence of entrenched vested interests in the political system, the lack of economic incentives, and the internalization of environmental costs in prices, the lack of alternative narratives of a good life and benchmarks for that, existing inequities in resource access, use, and power, and finally, a lack of information and skills for sustainable lifestyles and education. So these are the 7 most impactful structures that we've identified. Among those, the economic growth paradigm is by far the most important. We've done extensive interviews with experts from different countries, from different backgrounds, different disciplines. And by far the most of them have said it's the economic growth paradigm, the way it's internalized in the political system, in all forms of societal relations. That is the problem we face most of all in terms of making a change. How do we get beyond the situation? How do we get beyond the situation of entrenched unsustainability, where we have these really powerful structural barriers that keep us from making effective change? Most fundamentally, we need a different approach to the sustainability transformation, and especially transformation of consumption. And that is, we need to focus on structural change and go beyond focusing on technological efficiency and go beyond responsibilizing the individual. In this, we're up against the barriers just identified, and some ways forward that I'd like to discuss with you, if you agree that these could be possible ways forward. We're just discussing this in our consortium as well. As for instance, the deep integration of social justice and ecological sustainability, to make sure they're not understood as a trade-off between them. And actually such a deep integration also goes beyond the typical thinking. The typical thinking we use in this context is say, oh, okay, so we need an ecological fuel tax, but that will hurt poor people who need the car to commute, and therefore we compensate them. That's also a way of connecting social justice and ecological thinking. But I think a deep integration of those two aspects means we have to start thinking about this earlier. We actually have to start thinking about this at the beginning, at the current situation. And the current situation is that the economic elites are the ones benefiting the most from the status of insustainability, while the costs of climate change are being socialized. And so the most socially unjust thing we can do is not to act on climate change. And that needs to be highlighted, and that needs to be understood and communicated. We also need to mainstream alternative ideas of a good life that are not high consumption lifestyles. Those ideas already exist. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to develop them, but we have to find a way to mainstream them. And that means we also need to look at the world of communication, and we also need to look at the role of private media and clickbaiting and marketing plays in all of that. We need new political and societal alliances in order to go up against the vested interests that are very powerful. And that means that we need to bring, on the one side, ecological and social actors together and make sure that we're pursuing joint targets. We also need alliances between civil society and science. We also need alliances between civil society, science, and the media, who don't follow the model of pushing more consumption. And finally, and most fundamentally, we need a democratization of democracy. And that, again, addresses the question of how is power currently played out in democracy? Who are the powerful actors? Why do they have this power, the vested interests, for instance? But it also very fundamentally goes to the question of how can we create a broad societal dialogue? How can we make such a societal dialogue impactful? And how can we make sure the societal dialogue is about the issues that really matter, that is really about broad societal objectives? Now, whether you agree with me that these are ways forward or not, whatever we do when moving forward, when trying to tackle these huge issues, we always have to consider power in this. And that's what I want to close with, just reminding us of the role of power. And we need to consider who sets agendas, who defines rules and narrative, who selects instruments, who determines resources and their distribution. And this is crucially important if we want to identify effective strategic interventions and not just do something. When I think about power, I think about it in different forms. I think about material ideational sources of power, and I tend to differentiate between an instrumental use of power that tries to change policy output by lobbying, for instance, a structural use of power, structural material use of power that, for instance, corporations have today, and that they control vast financial resources and global networks, and via that can set agendas, predetermined agendas in the political arena, so that certain policy options are not even considered because politicians are afraid that that would cost jobs, that corporations would move to other countries. They also have rule setting, not just agenda setting, but rule setting power that way. And we see that in the kind of labels that corporations develop that determine market access and that determine what is considered in labels and what is not. And for instance, so many of the environmental labels we have in this context are labels that focus on documentation and reporting, but not necessarily at reducing pesticides in agri-food production, for instance, or such. And finally, there is this discursive power that is exercised via reference to norms and ideas, to values, that shapes narratives, that shapes how we define problems, how we define solutions, what is even considered a problem that is appropriate for politics to solve. It is used to frame actors as either responsible or not, as effective or not. And it's the most subtle and at the same time extremely powerful form of power, partly because it is so subtle and it's very difficult to challenge. Now these is an analytical lens to power. In reality, as with most analytical lenses we tend to use, in reality, these forms of powers overlap. But still, I think thinking about them in these analytical terms helps to remind us in how many ways, via how many different channels, power is exercised at any one point in time. And that's it. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I put up this little book here on consumption corridors. It's, as you can see, it's written by 7 authors, and in fact, it took 7 years to write this. And you will be able to read it in 2 hours, maximum 3 hours. And that's because we actually took the time to make it really short and to make it really accessible also beyond the social science sphere. And I would hope that you enjoyed. It's open access, so that's also a reason I put it up. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're open up for questions soon, but I'll just start off with some questions, or at least 1 or 2 questions. And one question that I have myself is that if you have some ideas about what we as researchers in that are working with sustainable consumption, is there anything that we should do more of and anything we should do less of in our research? Do you have any ideas about that, thoughts on that?
I'll talk about what we should do more rather than less. I do think that it is actually really important to look at these fundamental barriers, structural barriers that we're up against with sustainable consumption, and continue to highlight them and continue to highlight their connection to how our democracy is currently working. And in part, this democracy is dysfunctional. And I'm not saying we should give up on democracy, importantly. I think democracy is the best option we have, but we need to make sure that it functions better again, and that it's effective in helping us actually manage a transition to a more sustainable way of life. And so I do think that we need to consider sustainable consumption in its political context and bring our thinking about democracy and sustainable consumption together. That's the one side. The other side is that, as you are aware of, in a political context, it's always good if you can bring numbers, right? Politicians will ask you, well, if I change this, what impact will it have? How many, tons of carbon will it save me? And that becomes really difficult, of course, when we talk about structural change, right? We have researchers who can calculate what difference it will make if people switch from a fossil fuel-based car to an electric vehicle, right? We can calculate those kinds of things. How do you calculate what it mean to give up on the growth paradigm? How do you calculate what it would mean to reduce the power of vested interests? So that's actually something that I think we really need to focus our energies on. Even if we can't put these kinds of numbers on it in the end, we need to somehow be able to say something about the impact of structural change.
Okay, thank you. And then I also, well, I have one question in the Q&A, so I'll check that one first. It is a question on you mentioned, no, in Sweden, research funding emphasizes partnerships with businesses and the public sector. What's your opinion on the potentials and pitfalls on research collaboration with social sectors, sorry?
Well, this is a double-edged sword, of course, right? On the one side, I do think that transdisciplinary research, that is research that really considers society and the different segments from beginning to end, and not just as an audience for our transfer of our results in the end, but that really takes them along and helps us define what are the research questions and so on. On the one side, I believe that this is really needed. We need to go in that direction. At the same time, we need to be careful, of course, in terms of who do we make ourselves dependent upon, and who do we allow to frame our research questions, right? So we need to be able to have a choice and who are our partners in research, and it needs to be able to fit. We have the situation in Germany that we have excellent collaborations with all kinds of stakeholders in research in many cases, but we've also had cases where there has been corporate funding for professorships at universities, and news got out that the corporations also influenced or tried to influence who was going to be hired as a professor there, as a researcher. And of course, that by itself, that really is really hurts freedom of research, and really hurts our ability to focus with our research on what is relevant for society and its future.
Thank you. That question was from Vishal Parekh, by the way, I forgot to say. I have another question from Göran Fimbeden, and that is that in many countries, including Sweden and Germany, impacts from consumption have decreased the last decades. Although it's not fast enough, it's still a decrease. What in our policy processes have enabled this progress, do you think?
Well, I'm not an expert on Sweden, and I would love to hear more from you and from Göran about it. And in Germany, I would say the picture is really mixed, right? It depends also on what you count, and very often the statistics that show a decrease in consumption impacts do still not count the full picture, even if they say they do. And we have certain areas of consumption where we actually still don't have agreement on how we count them. Now, what I think makes a difference in terms of consumption, what can be effective, are more stringent measures that go beyond informing the consumer. They can involve taxes if they're sufficient to be seen. And in some cases, they also just involve the regulation of markets of what is available. On the other side, if you want to use the carrot rather than the stick, in Germany, for instance, we've had a lot of support for renewable energies for a while. That makes a difference if funding is available. So it's not just the stick, it's also the carrot that can work. And an interesting effect in the EU project I was talking about, we conducted stakeholder thinking labs where we invited stakeholders from civil society, from business, from policy, to discuss what kind of steps forward we could take. And an interesting result was that both in Germany and especially also in Sweden, those stakeholders tended to move towards rather strict, rather powerful intervention measures, including bans for the most hazardous consumption activities, which politicians by themselves usually don't dare to adopt. But having these kind of stakeholder dialogues, again, bringing in society broadly, would perhaps open up the pathway for more acceptance of such strict measures.
We have another question from Gavin Nilsson Lewis, and who thanks you for the presentation, which Göran also did, by the way. And the question is regarding the 7 hinders that you outlined. Do you have any examples in practice or theory for how invested interest can be addressed?
I think that's actually a huge challenge. I think I very much would argue for making the influence of such interests as visible as possible. And there are different ways to do that. There are different actors focusing on that. Corporate Europe Observatory and such have for several years now published data, gathered data, published data insofar as you can get them. But yes, I would always try to name this influence, to try to make it visible, but because only then do we have a challenge to counter it, a chance to counter it.
Thank you. And another question from Sarah Skarp, who also thanks for this interesting talk. And regarding alternative narratives that you mentioned, they are third on the 1.5 degrees lifestyle list, but seems almost I'll just read what it says. It seems to me almost precede changes to current ways of doing. How can we work toward or with society to construct those narratives?
Yeah, by this ranking the 7, that doesn't mean that there should be considered in a temporal sequence. In fact, I do think that we need to pursue to target those 7 barriers at the same time. I can totally understand why one would say that the narratives have to change first. However, changing the narratives means that we also have to tackle parts of the system in terms of, a private media focused on growth and such. So they really interact, these barriers. How can we mainstream other narratives of a good life? I think we need broader coalitions of actors who do this together, who really do this in a joint and very concerted, targeted effort. I think we need the broad societal dialogue. So in many countries, we've now had citizen assemblies, and in Germany, for instance, we also have had them at different levels, and I know you have them in Sweden as well. One problem with the citizen assemblies is that they often deliberate, they come up with results, the results go into the political process and they are watered down or ignored. And the broader public does not hear enough about the deliberations taking place in these citizen assemblies. So we need to do both. If we have such approaches to democratic innovation. We need to make them visible. We need to make them heard. And we also need to make sure that in the end they have an impact.
So then I would ask Adam Svensson if you would like to ask your question yourself, or if you want me to read it. If you want to ask it, you can just then put on your microphone, I think. Yes.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes.
Wonderful. Yes, I was just interested in there's the issue of defining then responsibilities, and how do we define if we want to delegate responsibilities somehow, and if we were to say that the economic elite should take on responsibility to change first, because how we've been talking about responsibilities now, we've been individuals on all levels essentially. How would we then define that? Or is even talking about delegation of responsibilities as distracting from structural changes?
No, I don't think that they're talking about responsibility distracts for structural changes, because there's also responsibility for the structural changes, of course. And yes, I do think we need to talk about the economic elite rather than responsibilize every individual. Even for the individual consumer, I wouldn't say every individual consumer is completely absolved of responsibility. The big things, whether we decide to fly or whether we decide to buy an SUV, those are still things that the individual consumer should think about as well. But I do think that, again, it's like with the vested interests. I think we need to make the difference in resource consumption and the impact really visible. That's part of what I was talking about when I said deep integration of social justice and ecological considerations, because only then can we need to make that visible if we want to highlight how socially unjust not doing something is. So yes, I would absolutely say responsibilize the economic elite. However, saying that doesn't mean that I wouldn't also say governments are really responsible for creating structural change. And again, in order to get governments to do that in this very entrenched and sustainability situation, in this situation with vested powers and so on, again, it comes back to coalitions. It comes back to citizens, to civil society, to science. To show what is really needed to be done. And in this context, it's important that we talk not just about the consumer, but as a citizen, right? Because a citizen has a political role to play, not just as a voter, but even beyond voting, to make sure our voices are heard.
Thank you.
Thank you both for the question and the answer. I will then ask Valint if you want to pose your question, or if I should do it. You want to post your question?
Yes.
Yes.
So, sorry, just couldn't find the button. Thank you. So yes, I was wondering about the material and the ideational sources of power, and I was thinking maybe that's one of these sources easier to change to sustainability than the other. What I mean here is, like, for example, kind of like translate this material sources in my mind to like power held by capital or capitalism, while like ideational sources are like more abstract, how people think about certain topics connected to sustainability. And for me, like maybe with like modern things like, for example, social media, books, or all these things, it's easier to change the way how people think than like the power held by capital. I don't know. What do you think about this? Is it even correct way to go?
Yeah, it's all of these questions are really good and really difficult questions, I have to say. Now, when it comes to material and ideational sources of power, or how could what would be easier to target? yes, on the one side, if we think about education, if we especially think about, education from beginning to end, that is start really like with our small kids, and then our school kids and so on, then education, of course, can make a huge difference. And I sometimes think if only in the 70s we had started really revamping all curricula, and especially the economics curriculum, but really all curricula, we probably would be in a different spot now. At the same time, again, we cannot ignore education is not only happening in schools, and we cannot ignore the media context and the narratives that are pushed by the mainstream media. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, what we tell people, kids in school, how does that fare in context to what they hear on social media? And I have teenagers at home who spend way too much time on TikTok and such. And I can tell you that what they learn on TikTok has little to do with a sustainable future. And just because we provide them with different information at school, and in fact, they're just entering a phase of a month or so when they will be working on climate change at school. But that's a month, that's a few hours a day. And then they come home and they have all of this other information. So just because we tell them one thing at school, it's not going to change their thinking fundamentally necessarily, or their behavior. And in some ways, then it may be easier, in how do you say, quotation marks, to actually, redistribute material resources. And I say that knowing, of course, what we're up against. Nobody wants to have resources taken away from them, right? But at least when you take resources from one place and put them somewhere else, you have moved these resources, and with education, with trying to change thinking, it's not that clear if you have had an impact.
Thank you both. We have another question from Göran. Do you want to pose your question yourself?
Thanks again for a wonderful presentation. You emphasize the need for discussion or pressing on both on social justice and ecological transformation. In current debates, social justice is often used as an argument against ecological transformation. So how can we argue to avoid that situation? Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Göran. Yeah, it's the same situation in Germany, of course, right? So the Green Party is considered the urban elite that can afford sustainability, while the poorer segments of society can't, and so on. And sustainability is supposed to be too expensive. And I think we can and we have to, again, in collaboration between science and civil society, and in collaboration with coalitions between social and ecological actors, we have to emphasize how wrong that argument is. Because the most socially unjust we can do is not to act, right? Which is the situation now. And we, of course, also the Green Party in Germany has had to learn and has had to become smarter in making sure that it doesn't just promote an ecological solution to something, but always has to have a really good social frame, a social compensation plan, whatever for it. But really we have to make sure that from the beginning to the end, we think the social justice aspect and the ecological aspect together.
Thank you. I have a question then from Vishal again, but without a microphone, so I'll read that. You mentioned in your presentation, Weber, And what perspectives or scholarship on power have you found most useful for sustainable consumption research, and how?
Yeah. So Weber, of course, is a very basic definition of what power is in terms of influencing relationships, in terms of getting somebody to do something that would have otherwise not done. That's how Weber comes in. But mostly, actually, my framework is very much informed by both Gramsci and Stephen Luke's. In terms of Luke's different phases of power. What we can see, this direct influence on output, then stepping in earlier already before agendas are set, and then finally stepping in even earlier and framing the thinking so that it actually doesn't become clear anymore what is in whose interest. So these are my most important influences in my thinking about power.
And then a question from Hanna Egestrand. Do you want to pose your question directly?
Yes, for sure. Thank you. Exceptional presentation. Thanks a lot for that. I was wondering if you have any examples of policy measures that seem to not assume self-interested consumers, but rather citizens capable of wider concerns, still posed within a sustainable consumption kind of agenda.
Yeah, again, excellent, but difficult question. Where to draw the line there. The first that would come to my mind would be policy measures that encourage some form of shared collective action among consumers. So if you have policy measures that support, what's that in English again? I can't think of the English term right now. If that support consumers getting together and entering into an agreement, for instance, with a farmer, right? If you have policies that support consumers being able to interact, to exchange information, to have an impact as a collective rather than the individual consumer. Those would be the policies that I would think of first. But I would be interested if you have others, to hear if you have others in mind.
I just took the liberty to unmute myself again there, Rosa, to answer that, which, because I did have a follow-up question indeed. I was wondering about the movement now across Europe to ban fossil fuel advertising, and perhaps advertising even more generally than fossil fuels. Would that perhaps be something that's more sprung from a citizen rather than individual consumer perspective?
Absolutely. So I wasn't thinking of this in terms of a policy, because it's, at least in Germany, it's not being pushed by government. But any kinds of political activities in the broader sense, and I would include that, are of course then activities, political strategies that take the individual as a citizen in his or her role as a citizen rather than as a consumer.
Thank you.
Yeah, community-supported agriculture.
Yes,
Thank
you
you
see
so
that.
much.
Yes. Okay. But I'll start by thanking you very much, Doris, for this fantastic, insightful presentation. I'm very happy that you have were able to talk to us about this. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you again, Asa. I don't accept all that many invitations to talk, but when somebody invites me to talk about sustainable consumption and power.
Yes, yes, very good. So I hope we will meet in conferences and other to discuss this more in the future.
Absolutely. There's going to be a huge conference, not huge, but there's going to be a big conference in April next year in Lund.
Yes.
And I hope to see you all there.
Yes. a lot of us will be there anyway. So thank you very much, and I would also take the opportunity. I will also say that this is part of like a webinar series, so we will continue with other perspectives on power and transition, and on May 16th at 9 o'clock in the morning, Professor Max Koch from Lund University will talk about power and the state of degrowth transformations. So if you want to attend that and you want to be sure to be invited, you can send me a mail and I will make sure you get an invitation. And is there anything else I need to say before we leave? I don't think so. But so thank you everyone who participated, and especially thank you, Doris.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.